Hey there, everybody. My name is Chris, and this is All Decks Welcome. Normally, during the preamble, I like to build up to the topic, but this time, I want to give more of a disclaimer, both for this video and for the channel in general. Out of the color pie, blue is my least favorite color. You aren't going to hear me curse about it or anything extreme like that. This is simply the color that I struggle with the most. I've played Control, I've played Tempo, and like I've said before, two of my favorite tricolors are Sultai and Temur that both involve blue, so it's not as though I hate it. It is the color that I'm typically the least excited about though, and that I struggle with from a deck building perspective. All of that is to say that if you have a deep passion for decks focused around blue cards, awesome, great. I've played against a mono blue deck whose only win con was 4, didn't say please, so you'd run out of cards first, and I loved it. But if you ever feel like blue gets underrepresented here, I'm sorry. It's not intentional, and I am aware of how I struggle with it. I hope I can do a half decent job of talking about it though, and that I can learn to love this color more as time goes on and we explore deeper into it. Okay? Okay. Let's talk about a card that's been banned for being no fun to play against. Nexus of Fate is a card that I never got around to playing with before it was banned in basically every 60 card format slow enough to make full use of it. This one's a doozy, a limited print run that has made its price constantly higher than maybe it should have been, and now that we live in a wasteland populated by every iteration of decks winning with Thassa's Oracle you can imagine, it would clearly be even worse for Pioneer and Historic now than it used to be. If you want to discuss the concept of designing without downside, Nexus of Fate is a strong contender. 7 mana is a high price to pay for a spell, but taking an extra turn in a game of Magic can often be well worth the investment. Furthermore, it's at instant speed, letting you set up for 2 straight turns at the end of your opponent's turn, surprising them when they may have thought you were holding up counter magic instead. Then comes the final line of text. If we are discussing card design, then this specific ability needs to be talked about with a certain amount of care, because saying that it's a downside ignores what makes this card so strong, while saying it's an upside ignores the play restrictions it was likely meant to create. So like the name of this video suggests, let's talk about the strongest 2 mana spell ever printed. For those of you who don't know about this, the Power 9 are considered to be the most powerful cards ever printed in Magic. One of them gets a certain amount of debate in Commander circles, but the bottom line is that these are cards with the most powerful, game-breaking effects in Magic. The 5 original Mox cards, Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, Time Twister, and Time Walk. Time Walk is a 2-mana sorcery that lets you take an extra turn, the same way that Nexus of Fate does for a significantly higher mana cost. 2 mana relative to 7 makes a huge difference because it means what you're capable of doing on the turn you played is significantly higher, be it removal, putting down creatures to attack with next turn, or finding ways to play Time Walk again. Big shout out to North 100 here. It's a podcast about Canadian Highlander, a format I'm desperate to get into but don't have the Magic Online collection to ignore the lack of a local playgroup. It's also why I know that you can abuse even having one Time Walk in your deck by a variety of different options, including, but not necessarily limited to, using Eternal Witness to put it back in your hand before casting Ephemerate on her with your extra turn, thus letting you get your Time Walk back before casting Ephemerate on your now additional extra turn off its rebound. That blinks your Eternal Witness again, letting you get back Ephemerate and continue the loop. This is a loop that requires 3 mana at most on any of your additional turns, while also only costing 5 mana to begin with, 6 at most. This proves the power of being able to bring Time Walk back from your grave because it shows us how easily taking an infinite number of turns can become a broken cycle that never ends. Which brings us back to Nexus of Fate and its final section of text. This text here is to prevent this from being the same kind of problem as what we just discussed with Time Walk. It's also a part of why the original Eldrazi Titans had a similar line of text, along with creatures like Worldspine Worm. These are cards the designers want to make as hard to abuse in the graveyard as possible, and in the case of Nexus of Fate, actually impossible. Nexus of Fate's ability to shuffle itself back into the deck is a replacement effect, meaning that it never touches the graveyard and doesn't open a chance to respond to it being there. This is fantastic because it means you can't use shenanigans to pull it back into your hand to guarantee you'll always have it. The problem with that is that it means the decks built around it had one singular goal: make it so the only cards I draw are Nexus of Fate every turn. Winning after that becomes its own questionable situation, but that's the core concept. Remove your own deck from the equation, and in the process, remove your opponent from the proceedings. So how do you support this kind of ability? Well, as Thassa's Oracle would tell you, blue has a plethora of ways to strip down the deck. Search for Iskanta is one of the most powerful tools the deck has, removing cards that won't help you get to 7 mana or keep your opponent suppressed before becoming additional mana for Nexus, or using its activated ability to find whatever you need. Nexus being a fairly solid option at any time. Supreme Will gives you a counterspell that doubles as a way to find Nexus. These decks are traditionally in green-blue, meaning you also have cards like Growth Spiral that don't just help you ramp, but also help put answers into your hand. Strategic planning lets you pick out your favorite card out of the top 3 before pitching the rest, shortening your deck and potentially shuffling away Nexus you aren't ready for. Then there's Tameo, Collector of Tales, a powerful tool to help you find whatever card you need at the moment, while pitching cards away every turn. Counterspells are useful for a deck like this, but a major part of why this deck is in green is specifically for fog effects, named after the original 1 mana version of the card. These are cards that let you cancel any combat damage that would be dealt this turn. Haze of Pollen allowing the deck to cycle it when up against a creatureless deck like Control, while the original Fog means minimal mana investment, letting you use the rest of your mana to continue trying to dig with your additional draw spells, such as Hieroglyphic Illumination or Dig Through Time. You can then throw in cards like Wilderness Reclamation, a 4 mana enchantment that untaps all your lands at your end step, letting you throw as much mana as you can into draw spells or effects before untapping and casting Nexus, or still getting to hold up your fogs while digging as much as possible. Last but not least is their removal, something the deck plays very little of, but when it does is typically cards like Brazen Borrower or Blink of an Eye, cards meant to help limit what your opponent can do to try and slow you down, such as putting a Narset, Parter, or Veils back in their hand, or doing the same job as the fog effects of slowing down your opponent and buying you enough time to begin your looping turns. Which brings us to the last piece of this puzzle. How do you win? It's a good question. Planeswalkers like Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, are capable of winning a game of Magic on their own, letting your opponent draw what is effectively a now useless deck, but also runs into the problem of the fewer win conditions you play, the more counter magic you want. And the more counter magic you want, the less effectively you're thinning your deck. That's why lands with the ability to win the game became a huge part of the conversation. Castle Ardenvale means you can make a new token every turn until you have your opponent's life total and surplus attackers, while Gaia Reach Sanitarium lets you really abuse how Nexus throws itself back into your deck over and over again, by making your opponent draw their entire deck without ever getting a turn. Oh, but if you still want a powerful beatdown strategy, then Hydroid Krasis remains the amazing ramp monster he has always been, and can even stabilize the deck against something like Burn. Now, there's a real question some of you may have for me. Why have I gone this long just to talk about a card that's banned in its relevant formats? Well, one is because my friends had to keep smacking my hands away from it while it was legal. Two is because cards like this come and go. Cards with complex deck building questions and ridiculous paths to victory. Thassa's Oracle is a card that fulfills half of this after all. For all my problems with the card and what it did in Pioneer and Historic, it is an interesting question, and its predecessor Lab Maniac would be proud to see this kind of fervor reignite in so many players. Nexus of Fate wasn't banned because it was too strong after all. It was absolutely strong, not denying that, but the card was banned from its relevant formats because of play issues. Because between shuffling the card away over and over again, slowing the game down with fogs, making your opponent wait through 7 turns, and your deck still being half full to see if you can establish the loop or not, these slowed down tournament play, and made even the act of winning an exhausting experience. Magic is happy to let us have combo, and it's happy to let us tell other players they don't get to join in our one-player game. A deck that can't do either of those quickly, though, can cause a lot more issues in the community than it's worth, and unfortunately that was the fate of Nexus. Someday I'll talk about Modern Eggs, and we'll get to share some amazing stories of turns that took an entire tournament round. So what about Nexus in formats like Commander, Canadian Highlander, and other singleton formats, especially of the 100 card variety? Well, singleton is a major problem for a card you want to be looping like this. Its lack of abusability through the grave actually does help keep it from being a problem in singleton formats. It's a reminder of why cards like Karn's Temporal Sundering and Part the War Veil exile themselves as they resolve. Magic knows that single player games aren't something players want to be easily achieved. As it is, it can be difficult to play most take an extra turn spells in singleton, and although it means stealing from North 100 again, they gave the perfect way of looking at the floor of even a card like Time Walk. In its best case situation, you get to perform the actions you need to win the game, while your opponent thought they would get a chance to respond. At its worst, you've cast Explore. Now imagine spending 5 or even 7 mana for an Explore. And in Commander, taking extra turns is a good way to make the rest of the table turn on you for the simple bad manners of your play. After making my roommate playtest against modern Nexus deck I found online, I actually need to go play some Mono Green Stompy if I don't want our next Commander game to end with a bounty on my head. If you have any particularly rude cards you love to play, then leave them in the comments below. My absolute favorite is reminding people that green has exactly one full cleansing type effect. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore the colors you might struggle with, along with me, then subscribe. I get the feeling that making this channel put me back into the right timeline of my life and I don't plan on undoing it. Or just like the video because you're as much a fan of overly forced references as I am. And hey, even if you're stuck in a time loop, you should keep an eye out for odd police boxes, be careful driving at 88 miles an hour, live the best life you can because you only get the one, and practice good habits everybody. Or just like the video because you're as much a fan of overly forced references as I am.